Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome a familiar voice back to the program. That would be Alexander Salter. Actually, is it Dr. Salter? It is, isn't it, Alex?
It is, but please call me Alex.
Okay. And he is not only a Young Voices contributor, he's also an associate professor of economics at Rawls College of Business at Texas Tech University, and also a research fellow at the university's Free Market Institute. Any other hats you wear, Alex? That's quite a lot of things you're doing.
Well, many other hats that I wear, but I think organizationally that covers it.
Very good. You know, first of all, it's great to talk with you again. I've always enjoyed our conversations, but I'm very happy to be visiting with you about the topic of school choice, just because this is an idea who I believe the time has come for this idea. And particularly, you're reviewing a book by Corey DeAngelis, who's one of the leading proponents of school choice here in the U.S. Before we get into the book, I just wonder if we can get a definition on the table so that we're clear that we're talking about the same thing. When we talk about school choice, what's a good working definition for what that means?
That's a very good place to start. School choice refers to any one of a number of proposals. The thing that they all have in common is that they make public student funding transferable. So that means the parents have direct control over some aspects of how that education's funding is spent. The most popular or well-known form of the school choice program is probably vouchers, where you can take your government allocated payment and use it on tuition at a private school. The one that I favor, the school choice program that I favor, is actually education savings accounts. And the way an ESA, education savings account, works is, again, you get that per pupil funding given by the government, and you can use it on private school tuition, but you can also use it for a host of education-related expenses: counseling, tutoring, buying materials for forming a homeschool, a learning pod. So really, it's everything that a voucher is, but much more. It's the most flexible option out there, and it gives parents the maximum power and ability to craft the educational environment that's right for their kids, which is why I favor it.
I think that's a good distinction, too. And I'm very much in favor of school choice, and reluctantly I include vouchers, but vouchers have to pass through administrative hands, which means there's a great likelihood that strings are going to be attached by the time they finally, land in the hands of parents. I want as much control as possible. Something you point out in your article, and this blew me away. I didn't realize that making education funding transferable was an idea that goes back a lot further than I thought. Tell me about Milton Friedman's thoughts on this, and how far back did that go?
I don't even think Milton Friedman was the first, but in the post-World War II era, he got the ball rolling in terms of popularizing the idea amongst conservative and libertarian intellectuals, those who wanted to empower parents. The rallying cry of the movement now for school choice is fund students, not systems. And as you noted, Corey DeAngelis, probably the leading proponent of school choice in the nation today, is famous for popularizing that statement, among others. But yes, school choice financing proposals have a long and distinguished history. Milton Friedman, an economist, Nobel laureate, first popularized it in a book shortly after World War II. It entered into the conservative policy space, the libertarian policy space, and for obvious reasons it caught on, but it was always sort of a wonky thing that had a hard time getting public approval and widespread interest. There are a couple of pilot programs here and there, but what really set the whole thing off wasn't academic white papers. It was the public school systems across the country and how they responded to the coronavirus pandemic. School closures, oftentimes much, much longer than necessary, unresponsive public school officials, teachers unions who tried to use the school shutdowns to get themselves leverage to get funding for things that had nothing to do with public health and safety, and also Zoom school, which was awful. The silver lining was that parents got to see up close and personal what their students were actually learning, and you should probably put learning in quotes given the content of a lot of these curricula, and they weren't happy. So school choice now has a lot of force behind it. It's a national movement driven mostly by concerned parents who say, hey, we think the state should exist to serve us, not us to exist to serve the state. The whole point of public education is to make sure that our kids have the resources necessary to pursue the best education possible. And we just can't get that under the current system. So we need to shake things up.
Tell me a little bit about Corey's book, The Parent Revolution.
Corey's book is great. I enjoy it. I recommend it to everybody who's interested in school choice. Corey's been at the forefront of these debates for years, and his book is really a narrative of how school choice went from being an interesting intellectual idea and a policy proposal to arguably the single biggest educational issue in the nation and a national movement in its own right. He starts with the coronavirus pandemic and the public school system's frankly unimpressive responses to it. He goes through the surging movement in several states to actually change how we finance public education to make sure that the funding can be transferable to maximally empower parents. And of course, he spends a chapter addressing key arguments against school choice, this idea that it's somehow going to destroy the public school system, which is not true. So you got to make sure that you actually look at the social science on this, because given that there are a few pilot programs out there, both in the United States and elsewhere, we do have data on this. And school choice pretty unambiguously improves educational outcomes for students and delivers better outcomes for parents at less cost to the taxpayer. So going through the successes in various states like West Virginia, Iowa, Arizona, Florida. There's even a portion of a chapter on Texas, where I currently live. I'm a proud adopted Texan. We never got the ball across the finish line in the last legislative session, but I'm optimistic about the 2025 legislative session. I think it would be really great if Texas could join the rank of school choice states.
In my home state of Idaho, we've had the very same problem, and it's the same. It's the teachers' unions and legislators who are beholden to the teachers' unions that seem to keep it from advancing. Now, having said that, though, you mentioned earlier one of Corey's things that he brought up that makes it kind of easy to summarize: fund students, not systems, or let the money follow the students, not just the systems. Here in Idaho, I'm paraphrasing here, but I believe the grade level competency, about 8th grade, you're talking about 39% literacy, both in math and in reading for 8th grade students. And the answer, of course, always from career politicians and the teachers union and sycophants in the legacy media is, well, they just need more funding. But it doesn't sound like pouring more money into the system is necessarily delivering on the results. Is this something that's being seen in other districts and other systems across the country?
Just about everywhere. If this were a simple funding problem, it would have gotten solved a long time ago. You're not going to be able to throw more money at this and improve educational outcomes, because the problem is the system and the incentives that it has, or rather the incentives that it doesn't have for actually delivering effective educational outcomes. Think about it this way. I live in Texas. In Texas, a popular grocery chain is United Supermarkets. Suppose by law, you had to shop at United Supermarkets. You were only allowed to shop at a United Supermarket that was in your zip code. You couldn't even leave your zip code to go shop at a supermarket. And every year, $8,000 of your money was going to United, in exchange for which you will get a pre-decided bundle of groceries. You don't even get to pick your bundle, right?
The experts pick it for you.
Right, exactly. They pick it for you. If you want to, you can go to another grocery store, but you still have to give United that $8,000. If you want to go to H-E-B or somewhere else, you have to pay out of pocket to get even more food. What would you expect to be the average quality of the outcome here, of the food that you get, of the customer service experience? It would be miserable because there's no competition.
Right.
School choice takes that insight and runs with it. We need to introduce genuine competition and competitive feedback into the system. We need to make sure that parents have maximal ability to take that funding and put it where they perceive it's most effective. Education shouldn't be a top-down bureaucratized model. It's too important for there to be a single point of failure. We should have 1,000 different educational models blooming, driven by parental empowerment and parental choice, and making sure that funding is transferable. By funding students instead of systems, we can do that.
I could be wrong, but I think that I've heard Corey use the analogy too, that oftentimes, and I'm picking on the teachers union specifically, it's like they teach the public schools, they treat the public school system rather as if it were for the benefit of the teachers and administrators as opposed to the students. In other words, the needs of the staff seem to come over the students and whatever outcomes they're enjoying.
Yeah, it's pretty unfortunate, since oftentimes public school teachers themselves are frankly some of the best people that you're ever going to meet. They're hardworking, they're dedicated, they just want to do right by their kids. It's the officials who are heavily invested in and work within the teachers unions who are often, frankly, more political officials than they are public school teachers that are really ruining the thing for everybody. And so it's unfortunate that you have so many people, that you have one bad apple ruining the whole barrel, so to speak. But that's the situation that we confront. That's the situation that we're in. Despite ample funding, the results are pretty terrible, and there's no sign of them getting better.
All right.
The challenges of the 21st century job market are going to be too strong to continue putting up with failing education. It's time to make that funding transferable now so we can get as many kids a quality education as possible.
And with that, we are up against the clock here. Alex, great to talk with you once again. People who wish to follow you, where can they find you?
I'm on both Facebook and LinkedIn, and they can always find my writings and my media appearances at my personal website, www.awsalter.com.
Welcome back. We are happy to welcome back to the show Daniel Dorman, who is a Young Voices contributor. And Daniel, if you'll take just a moment for the sake of those meeting you for the first time, tell us a little bit about who you are.
Absolutely. Thanks, Brian. Really glad to be here. My name's Daniel Dorman. I'm a contributor to Young Voices, as well as the director of communications at a public policy think tank based in Ottawa, focusing on the federal government in Ottawa, as well as a range of issues that are in the public sphere, in the public debate in Canada.
I'm looking at an article you wrote for the Toronto Sun, and my wife is a public school teacher, so sometimes I hear the lesson or the tales she tells about things that she has to deal with in the classroom. But this headline, our public schools need a lot more than a vape and cell phone ban. And as I delved into the article, I was like, oh my word, that's really a policy. And I guess this was in Toronto that they passed a ban on vaping in class and using cell phones in class. Talk to me a little bit about what prompted that, and then let's talk about why that may not be enough to fix what needs to be fixed within public schools.
Yeah, absolutely. Some context for American listeners, as well as in Canada, our education systems are provincial. So this was the Ontario education minister that made this move for a behavioral change in classrooms. And it's actually, I think, as I say in the article, I don't think anybody thinks it's a bad idea to ban vapes or to not have cell phones distracting students. The question is, why were those behaviors ever allowed? And is the behavioral change enough, as you say? And in the article, I argue that it's certainly not, even though it's a good direction to go in.
Wow. I mean, this is not to suggest that, boy, in my day, the kids were all angels. Look, we had a back parking lot, and vaping was not a thing, but if you wanted a cigarette, that's where you would find the kids who were, going to smoke a cigarette or whatnot. But it just seems like it's a very different atmosphere today, and I'm not sure what I would attribute that to.
Fair enough. I think it is a very different atmosphere, and what I get into the article in the article a little bit is just in terms of the curriculum and some of the ways that it really lacks, particularly in and this is perhaps a bit different in the U.S. I think Americans feel a bit more connection to country, whereas Canadians, especially young Canadians, increasingly are being really taught to despise what they know of their country. They don't like because they're taught so little history. In particular. So I think that may contribute to the atmosphere. If you're being indoctrinated into something entirely negative, maybe you're just disinterested in school even more than you would be. So it's a sad state of affairs in several ways. And I will say just briefly, and I mentioned this in the article too, noting, your wife is a public school teacher, and I have many friends and family that are involved in the public education system that I really don't blame individual teachers. In fact, I think many teachers have been, just pushed up against the wall, trying to enforce some better behavior, trying to improve curriculum, trying to go above and beyond for students, and they've just been trapped in a pretty bad system, in a curriculum that does not have what it should, and in a system broadly that doesn't allow for any sort of school choice, which I know different American jurisdictions are heading towards. Maybe, hopefully, Canada could head towards as well.
So you mentioned the word indoctrination, and I want to counter that, or actually contrast that with education. And one of the things you point out in your article is, from your experience, the worst thing about public education is its complete failure to educate. So let's start there. When it comes to educating, what are we talking about? For a student to be educated, what all does that entail?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I try to answer that in the article by just saying an educated person should be able to have informed opinions in an area in which they're educated. It's a pretty direct, pretty straightforward definition. But I think, if Canadian public school students are supposedly educated in history and English and many of these disciplines that I think are lacking, they should know who someone like Plato is, someone like Aristotle is. They should know probably who the founders of Canada were, and I think maybe they know who they are, but they only know their worst traits that are paraded around. So I think, yeah, an educated person needs to be aware of the conversation that has gone on and to be informed by that is the simple answer.
And again, I'm going to come back to that word indoctrination. Indoctrination doesn't really seem to inculcate a desire to know more, to seek out, to ask questions, to try to dig deeper and find a better or deeper understanding or a broader perspective of the issue at hand. It's no, this is what you're supposed to believe. Now repeat it in unison, everybody. Okay. And that seems to be the sum of indoctrination. Talk to me about what you see in terms of indoctrination in some of the provincial schools there in Canada, or maybe just in public education in general. It seems like we don't have as much emphasis today on encouraging students to be free thinkers.
Well, yeah, and I think if you're going to think freely, again, you have to be aware of the conversation that has gone on. I think you look at, if as an example of indoctrination, if a young student anywhere, for example, has adopted some postmodern attitudes towards something or some extremely progressive views towards something, but they don't know the postmodern thinker who founded those ideas, and they're not aware that say Foucault, they don't know that Foucault was responding to something. They're not even aware that they're in a conversation. And I think how can you be free to think critically if you've adopted positions without any of the background information? Like, that's again the opposite of a liberal education, to add one more word into this discussion. Indoctrination is the opposite of that. And I think that the failure to go into the primary text, the failure to give a sense without even dictating what a student should think on a subject, but just that they should probably know who said intelligent things about it.
No, I get it.
Basic, yeah.
And I agree. Look, for a long time I labored under the idea that these guys, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, I'm picturing them in togas going around, with one hand gesturing to the skies. They orated about whatever it was, some free stream of thought, kind of thing. But then I actually got to read some of their writings and was blown away. In fact, Plato made my head hurt as I tried to read the Platonic dialogues. It was above my head, and it was difficult. It took effort to understand, but as I persisted in those efforts, I also found that it helped shape my thinking, which doesn't mean I was suddenly walking in lockstep on everything that they said, but the way that they thought about things, the way they examined things, helped me to order my own thinking to better understand what kind of questions I needed to ask if I wanted to understand, an issue that we're looking at today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think most students would be shocked to interact with any of the thinkers of the past. I mean, the densely rational and, as you say, difficult but extremely valuable thinkers like Plato or Aristotle that really do interact with ideas that are core to our own cultural identities right now. And so if we're going to make any sincere progress, we should listen to those good voices. Yeah.
Is there any hope of that coming back into fashion in the sense of a liberal arts education within public schools, or are public schools, kind of meant to go in a different direction?
I've had some really interesting conversations with folks since the article came out, and some of them were essentially saying, we just need to pull off of the idea of public education altogether, promote school choice, and in that just move towards independent schools or classical schools. And I certainly think that that's a great direction to go in. My sense is that public schools are going to exist, so we should probably, as a culture, if we're going to be funding those through our government, know what's said in them and push them to be better, even if we also advocate for school choice and independent schools at the same time.
I kind of like the idea of training up a generation or two of autodidacts and people who, on their own time and in their own, their own bedroom or at their own kitchen table, will sit down and read those classic works of Western literature.
Absolutely. Yeah, your listeners won't be able to see the books behind me, but I have loved the experience of being inspired by some teachers later in life outside the public system that turned me into a reader and into a lover of the conversation, a person who desires to have informed opinions. And I hope that can be replicated elsewhere for many others.
I love the fact that you're showing by example. It's a lifelong effort. You never stop learning. It's not, my brain's full, I'm done. Again, we're talking with Daniel Dorman. Daniel, for people who want to follow you on social media or otherwise find your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. Just search Daniel Dorman, Dorman with 1 O on Twitter or LinkedIn, and happy to chat with you there. That'd be awesome.
Great to visit with you once again. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. Really great to be here. Very
Welcome back to Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome back to the show Issac Willour. Issac is an award-winning journalist and also a corporate analyst at Boyer Research, and he's also a Young Voices contributor, and I'm probably leaving out a few of the other things that you do. Take a moment. Tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Yeah, Brian, thanks for having me on. I mean, yeah, you basically hit all the highlights. Yeah, so I do corporate analysis. I analyze some of the biggest corporations in America for political bias, politicization of corporate policies and practice, that kind of thing. And then, yeah, I do journalism on the side. I do Young Voices, and it's great to be back.
So I hear about ESG things from time to time, and I'll admit this one was not on my radar screen, but apparently some of the ESG activism is involving Israel. And
So,
can you kind of bring me up to speed on how that all fits together?
yeah, absolutely. So let's start just kind of at a very baseline. So ESG is an acronym that stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. There is an "and" there, which is important. I hear people say environmental social governance, which doesn't fully get at the scope of, because a lot of the issues surrounding ESG, especially that we've seen recently, have to do with corporate governance. It has to do with who has control of boards, who are boards truly considered to be accountable to. The reality of the situation, unfortunately, is that a lot of ESG activists, we're seeing this right now with ExxonMobil, a lot of ESG activists are absolutely convinced that the boards of big companies and big companies themselves work for activists and exist to appease the demands of activists, when that's not in fact true. Obviously, they exist to appease or to serve the interests of shareholders. This is basic fiduciary duty type stuff. So yeah, so on to the Israel. So the push for divestment from Israel is nothing new, right? We've seen this for years with the BDS movement, right? The boycott, divestment, sanction movement. That predates October 7th by several years. And we've seen, in terms of the college campus stuff, we've seen demands for divestment at Yale, Columbia, etc. But, the thing about demands made by college protesters, they don't actually mean that much, because you're sitting in a tent city and, defecating on yourself. And it's just really not a move that inspires respectability in my mind. But the problem is this is not limited to the quad at Yale or the tent city at Columbia. It is, these activists are showing up at the boards of America's biggest companies, and that includes companies not like just Ben and Jerry's, right? It's not just Ben and Jerry's advocating for BDS, this kind of stuff. They're showing up at companies like Lockheed. They're showing up at companies like Raytheon, and most notably, most recently, Amazon has been the target of these companies. And the ask is always the same, is that in order to align itself with what these activists would call human rights concerns, which is a fancy word for Israel is doing wartime things at war. In order to align themselves humanitarianly, these companies have to align themselves with certain values. And that means that's basically code for divesting from Israel in the vast majority of cases. And I've written about this a bit at Real Clear. I'm writing about this a bit at Daily Wire. It's not, these proposals are bathed in language of human rights, human decency. The implicit premise is that if you are supporting Israel, if your company is supporting Israel, if you're doing business with Israeli clients, Israeli vendors, even companies like TripAdvisor are getting these activists showing up at their door. The implicit premise is that if you're continuing to do business with Israel, with the Israeli state in any way, shape, or form, you're complicit in everything militarily, politically that's happened, especially since October 7th. And I mean, there's a certain degree of emotional pull there, right? When we look at the offensive in Rafah, et cetera, especially recently, there's some pull to this. But the demand has been what does it mean for Lockheed to divest from Israel? Lockheed has an ongoing contract with the Israeli Defense Force, right? What does it mean for Lockheed to divest from Israel? It means that Israel has less means to protect its national sovereignty and defend its citizens, right? It's not just the Israeli military and the military industrial complex that everyone likes to talk about. It's not just that that's going to be affected. It's innocent Israeli civilians. And the same can be said most notably about Amazon. Amazon had its annual meeting a couple of days ago, last week, in fact. And the big ask with Amazon is that Amazon Web Services is being used in some of the Israeli government's surveillance projects, a thing called Project Nimbus, which it's a thing that uses cloud computing. It's defending Israeli national sovereignty. And the ask has been, well, it's furthering an apartheid system. That was the phrase that was used. I didn't make that up. That's directly from the corporate proposal. And in order to not foment the Israeli apartheid system, and I use that term in quotes, Amazon needs to stop doing business with Israel. Raytheon needs to stop doing business with Israel. And yeah, I think it's way past time. This is not just a human rights concern. The consequences of these proposals, which are not passing, by the way, and we can talk about the margins if you want, but the reality of the corporate and human consequences of these proposals are quite morally abhorrent, and we need to be spending more time talking about that.
I have to ask, when did corporate America kind of become an enforcement arm of acceptable opinions or acceptable, ideals? Because it seems like that's fairly recent.
That's the real question, right? And so I work at a firm, it's called Boyer Research, and one of the things we do, one of our big slogans is we're working to depoliticize the business process, right? We want a politically neutral business space because companies are not primarily designed to carry out ideological things beyond like basic global commitments to human rights, that kind of thing, which in fairness is what a lot of these ESG activists would say is on the table about Israel. We can have discussions about how that criticism isn't super accurate. But yeah, no, a lot of big businesses, whether it's climate change, climate risk, that kind of thing, Second Amendment stuff. A couple of years ago, especially after 2020, there was a lot of racial justice stuff. One of the really big arenas we're seeing right now is the whole idea of medical transition for children, right? Trans surgeries for kids. These are the fights that big business is having to weigh. And these are the fights that ESG activists have decided this is what America's biggest companies need to be spending their time on. Companies like Disney, right? We need to really be focusing on getting more racial minority trans people into Disney movies and ignore the fact that the brand's lost $70 billion. It's fine as long as there's more racial minority trans people in the movies. This is fine. It has nothing to do with the fiduciary duty to actually provide money to your shareholders because they're making good movies and products or things that people actually want to do. It's about social criterion, not economic criterion whatsoever. Wow.
Yeah, it does make things complicated, and of course you add politics in on top of that. And I know Israel's kind of a hot button issue. Are there companies that can safely ignore these ESG pressures, or is that difficult to do once you are in the upper ranks of corporate, the corporate world?
Yeah, because it's like this is arguably. And there's some real exceptions we can talk about. Masterpiece Cake Shop, right? We can talk about some of the small business side. But yeah, once you're in the Fortune 500, once you're in the Fortune 100, yeah, this is just the conversation that you have to have. And I mean, right now we talked about. I mentioned ExxonMobil briefly a little while ago. They're really having to make this decision about: are we going to listen to shareholder voices that want us to do things that violate our fiduciary duty? Is that what we want to do? Are we going to appease that? Are we going to eat the short-term losses of that under the promise that there's going to be some long-term gain? There won't be, by the way, but are we going to appease that? So yeah, this is a question that big businesses are having to answer. I think the reality of many of these ESG demands, like for example, if Lockheed terminates its contract with Israel, they lose a bunch of money. Their shareholders lose a bunch of money. And I think we can have a discussion about whether capitalism, and I hate the term capitalism, whether the free enterprise system encourages greed, incentivizes greed. But at some point, businesses have a responsibility to make money for the people that have invested their capital into them. And that, I think, in our job now, as conservatives, as free marketers, is to push the idea that is where business's responsibility lie, not to ESG activists, but to the shareholders that they work for, right? Boards work for CEOs, work for boards work for shareholders. That's how it's always been. That's how it needs to be again, or else more brands are going to get destroyed.
I think you used the example of Starbucks. And, maybe could you take just a moment and describe, in order to be environmentally conscious, what was Starbucks being asked to do?
This is the best story ever. So I ran a piece at Real Clear Markets a couple months ago called, what was it? I want to say the title was "The ESG Lobby Wants You to Fight Racism with Oat Milk." And the idea behind this is one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen, is activists at PETA, right? People for the ethical treatment of animals, who are just known for being such level-headed culture warriors. They're pushing Starbucks because, as you probably know, I don't know if you drink oat milk or not, but regardless, oat milk is more expensive than traditional dairy, right? It's like a 70-cent upcharge at Starbucks. And PETA decided to come down the aisle and say, no, this is absolutely not a thing. And you have to eat the cost. You have to make these things, you have to offer these things at the same price to fight racism and climate change. This is dumb, and we're allowed to make fun of that as much as humanly possible, and we should be, because it's an example of how, if you've really bought into ESG, if you're a true believer in the ESG framework of who big businesses work for, this all makes sense to you, right? This is all completely believable. And for all of us who live in normal world where business is supposed to make money, it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it's your duty to lose money to do the right thing.
That's right. Yeah, because it's don't be evil, right? It's that whole Tim Cook line from a couple of years ago.
Again, we're talking with Issac Willour. Isaac, where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Issac Willour, ISAACWILLOUR, and then youngvoices.org, of course.